Hey everyone, welcome back to the What Do They Know podcast. Nick is solo for one more week and he will break down all the top stories from this week, including the big Christmas night game between the Ravens and the 49ers. Nick will also give his take on the current MVP race as we get down to the last 2 weeks of the season, and he'll give you some games to watch out for next week. But hey, what do they know?
What do they know? Well, we are about to find out what's going on, everybody. This is the Week 16 edition of the What Do They Know podcast. Nick Hoskins back with you this week, flying solo for one more week before we get back our co-host, Jeff Garcia, who I think is en route or just barely getting home as we speak, as we're sitting here Tuesday night. We're recording a little late due to Christmas, so hopefully everybody had a great time with their families and got to watch some of the football because there were a lot of good games this past weekend. So I'm going to try and break some of it down for you and get you guys ready for the last 2 weeks of the season. And then Jeff and I will be back in person, probably going to be delayed again this coming week because of New Year's Eve and New Year's. But we have plans to get together and make sure we get something out for you next week. So just jumping right into the top stories. I think, the clear cut story for this week was the Baltimore Ravens. The 11-3 traveling all the way to San Francisco, who also was 11-3. Everybody kind of assumed, San Francisco is the team to beat in the NFL, the clear cut Super Bowl favorites. And Baltimore just went in and punched them right in the mouth. They're one of the few teams who showed they can match the physicality of the 49ers. Everybody talks about Lamar Jackson and the run game and the weapons that they have on offense with the receivers, Zay Flowers, Odell Beckham, Isaiah Likely, or Mark Andrews when he's healthy. But nobody really talks about the defense, and their defense showed out last night. They forced Brock Purdy to throw 4 interceptions, 3 of them in the first half. One of them was just a great athletic play, kind of a tipped pass at the line of scrimmage on a screen. So nothing really necessarily that Brock did anything, Brock did wrong there. But the other 2 were definitely, trying to force some throws, trying to make stuff happen. And the defense just jumped in and made plays and did what they did. So I feel like their full effect was on display last night from their offense to, like I said, their defense. And when you consider they did not get off, they got off to a very ominous start with a crazy play that I've actually never seen before, with Lamar Jackson tripping over one of the umpires in the end zone and trying to throw the ball away, which he then got called for intentional grounding and ultimately a safety, which was bizarre. Like I said, I've never seen that before. He was scrambling to his left, trying to evade some pressure. The umpire slipped in the end zone, and so he was just kind of laying there. And Lamar obviously didn't see him. His back was to him, so when he tried to scramble, he tripped over him and ended up throwing the ball away. And like I said, getting a penalty for intentional grounding, which ultimately, when that happens in the end zone, that's a safety. So bizarre way to start the game. I think that was in the first 5 minutes of the game. You're down 2-0 for something that really you could say wasn't even their fault. It wasn't anybody's fault. It's just something that happens. But they battled back. I kind of felt like when that happened, that was a sign of things to come for the night. I kind of felt like, that was the 49ers gaining their momentum in maybe a way that nobody saw, but nobody saw coming. But that didn't happen. Baltimore, credit to them. They kept going and they made plays and they won that game handily. So they put the rest of the league on notice, which I'm selfishly excited about. At the beginning of the season, this matchup was my Super Bowl prediction, and I picked the Ravens to actually come out on top, which going into last night, I did not think was going to happen if the 2 did meet in the Super Bowl. I kind of felt like it was the Niners to lose, and the Ravens went out and showed me and showed everybody else that they are the team to beat in the NFL. So that was, I hope we see that rematch again, because there was so much energy, so much adrenaline in that game. Defenses were just flying around. Receivers were trying to make plays. McCaffrey, George Kittle, everybody. There's just a ton of stars on those 2 teams. So I would love to see that rematch in the Super Bowl. One of my top stories is just what a terrible take I had last week. I'm kind of putting myself on blast here, but for those of you who listened last week, one of my predictions was that the Chiefs were in a really good spot to actually sneak, kind of come out of nowhere and take the number 1 seed from both Miami and Baltimore, given the schedules of all 3 teams. Kansas City had on paper a much easier schedule, and Baltimore and Miami both have a really tough schedule to end the season. But it was the complete opposite. Kansas City looked absolutely horrible against the Raiders on Christmas Day. And both Miami and Baltimore ended up winning their games, which were tough matchups that they were both expected to lose. So now, obviously, that is not going to happen. And that was a really, really, just horrible take from me, honestly. But the bigger story is obviously not my take. It's how the Chiefs are playing and just how disjointed they are. I feel like, they tricked me with their win against against New England. I think they put up 27 points and it, kind of seemed like maybe they were going to figure it out. And it was just the opposite. They, from the very beginning of the game, 2 straight 3-and-outs to start the game, which the Chiefs never do, much less twice in a row. They had 2 plays in a row on offense that were turnovers. It was a fumbled exchange between Mahomes and Isaiah Pacheco, and then an interception from Mahomes, and both of those got returned for a touchdown. So you're talking about 2 back-to-back plays spotting your opponent 14 points. And it's just, you can just kind of see it. It's starting to become more and more visible. Obviously, you had the outburst from Mahomes a few weeks ago in the Bills game, but this week, you had Travis Kelce slamming his helmet on the sideline, and then there was that clip of Andy Reid kind of putting him in his place, for lack of a better term, and basically telling him that to cut it out. It kind of gave him a shoulder shiver, which you don't really see anybody in the NFL do, much less a coach. Kind of lower his shoulder into him, and it was a pretty heated and pretty passionate conversation. So you can kind of obviously that stuff is starting to bubble over, and things are coming to the surface, which there's just got to be so much frustration with that team. Think about the fact that they're defending Super Bowl champs, and how stagnant their offense is right now. We've talked about it at length on this show, a couple of different things, right? They have gotten to the point where if you take away Travis Kelce, you're done. You have nobody else. You have Isaiah Pacheco to run the ball, get a few good yards. He's a grinder. He's going to get you yards after contact. He's great, but when you take away Kelce, everybody's on record. They do not have quality receivers to throw to. And, it's kind of shown in Kelce's numbers the last, I think, 3 or 4 weeks. He's been held to 4 or 5 catches for, anywhere from 40 to 50 yards the last 3 weeks. And that is not a Travis Kelce stat line. And I don't think it's easy enough to just boil it down to, well, he's getting old. I think it's the fact that teams have figured out how to contain him and know that if they do that, the rest of the offense is just not going to be able to flow and not going to be able to perform. And that's a problem. It's never good when you can eliminate one person from your offense and basically take away your entire game plan. So the Chiefs, man, I think that, Jeff called it super early this season, and so credit to him. They very easily could be one and done in the playoffs, because you think about the seedings in the AFC right now, 1 through 7. Who do you feel like where you can look at them and say, oh yeah, the Chiefs are definitely going to beat them? I mean, you look at your wild card teams right now, they're the options of who they have to play. I'll read it off as of we sit here, Tuesday night. So the 3 wild card teams are, excuse me, Cleveland at 5, Buffalo at 6, and Indy at 7. There's none of those teams that I look at and say, well, they definitely cannot beat Kansas City. Right now, it would be Buffalo at Kansas City right now. And we've already seen that rematch once, and I would argue that Buffalo's playing better than they were then, and Kansas City's playing worse than they were then. So I think that, it's just not good for them. Obviously, I'm never going to sit here until I see it, right? Until I see Mahomes and the Chiefs lose in a round other than the Super Bowl or the AFC Championship game. I'm never going to say that. I'm never going to say they're done. But this is, I think, the year that it could finally happen. So, lot to figure out with the Chiefs. And I think that Jeff called it. At the end of the day, I think they're going to be one and done, and it's going to be a big storyline going into the offseason. And also, and they talked about this on ESPN radio this morning on my way to work, and Jeff and I kind of talked about it earlier in the season. I think that this just continues to show the value of Eric Bieniemy and what they lost by letting him go to Washington. Because again, he was kind of the silent man. Everybody was giving credit to Andy Reid as being the offensive mastermind, and he probably is. He's probably a good majority of it. But when you lose Eric Bieniemy and you bring in, what was his name? He's the former head coach of Chicago. Matt Nagy, former head coach of Chicago. He was previously at Kansas City. He left to take the head coaching job at Chicago. He was a dud there. Their offense was terrible. Mitch Trubisky ended up being a bust because of Matt Nagy, and then he goes back to Kansas City. He replaces Bieniemy, and the offense looks like it does now. So I think that this season has done a lot, in my opinion, for the stock in Bieniemy, so to speak, like how valuable he is and how valuable he was when he was in Kansas City. So I think that that's something to watch this offseason, what they do from a coaching perspective, but also what they do from a personnel, obviously, perspective, addressing just the talent around Patrick Mahomes, because they cannot go another season with this lack of depth at the wide receiver position. They just can't. Another big story is the Tampa Bay Bucks. They are coming, I would say, kind of out of nowhere. They had a really good win against Jacksonville this week, beat them soundly, and they're now sitting at 8-7 in solo first place in the NFC South. 2 weeks left to go. Their remaining games are home to the Saints and at Carolina. So 2 division games. Carolina, on paper should be a win. And the Saints, who knows? They lost to St. Louis. They lost to the Rams, the LA Rams, on Thursday Night Football last week. But their offense, you could argue it was because of game script, but their offense is probably one of the better weeks that they've had. Derek Carr had a great game. Chris Olave had a phenomenal game. And so, who knows what you're going to get with the Saints? I feel like you just never know. But the Bucks, man, when you talk about Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans, I give credit to Jeff all the time for his takes. I'll kind of give myself some credit. I kind of thought this at the beginning of the year, that Baker Mayfield could have a little bit of a resurgence, and he and Mike Evans could have a really big connection this year. And it's proven to come to fruition exactly how I kind of thought that it could. They've been great. I saw something on social media today comparing the numbers between Baker Mayfield and Mahomes, and they're pretty much equivalent, or Baker's leading in a majority of the categories when you talk about yards per game, touchdown to interception ratio, QBR, all those things that you look at when you're evaluating a quarterback. They are very similar, if not, Baker might have the edge in a few of them. So he's having a great year. He's getting himself, I think he went to Tampa Bay on a 1-year deal, so he's definitely getting himself a contract somewhere. If it's not an extension in Tampa Bay, who knows? It could be. But really happy for Baker. I've always been a Baker fan. I know he's kind of, you either love him or hate him. But I've always been a fan. I think he plays with just crazy passion. And, he's always been one of those guys where if he has momentum, or if he's on any sort of hot streak, watch out, because he's a force to be reckoned with. And I feel like he's on that right now. So they're having a great season. Credit to him and Todd Bowles. Everybody, my co-host included, Jeff, really, I think he picked them to finish last in the division with our predictions at the beginning of the season. And everybody kind of chalked it up to a rebuilding year for Tampa Bay. And it clearly has not been. It looks like they might, end up taking the division and have 9 or 10 wins, which, this division, everybody always jokes that you can win this division with 7 or 8 wins. And, it's not looking that way this season. So credit to the Bucks. I'm excited for Baker. I hope, they continue their success. Like I said, I really like Baker, and I feel like they've surprised a lot of people with how well they've played and the numbers that he and Mike Evans just continue to put up week after week. The AFC South is a really good story. We have 2 weeks left, and we have 3 teams at 8-7. When you talk about Jacksonville, Indianapolis, and Houston, Jacksonville obviously had a tough loss against the Bucs, like we just talked about. They're coming off, I think, 3 losses in a row now. When you talk about Cleveland, Baltimore, and now Tampa Bay, 3 losses in a row. So they're sitting there at a tie for first. Barely in the playoff picture. When you look at the remaining schedules, I think that it probably favors Jacksonville when they're home against the Panthers this week, and then they're at Tennessee. So 2 under 500 teams. We talk about the Panthers, who are the worst team in the league, and the Titans, who have all sorts of quarterback issues going between Will Levis and Ryan Tannehill. They're a 5-win team. So on paper, those are 2 good matchups for Jacksonville. Indianapolis, they're home against the Raiders, and then they're home against the Texans. I've already talked on this show about how that last week could very easily be for a wild card spot. But right now, who knows? It could be for the division as well, the way that these things are shaken out. And then Houston, they have the Titans this week, and then obviously at the Colts next week. So quarterbacks are the story of this division. Jacksonville, they reported today that Trevor Lawrence has a right shoulder sprain, and he didn't practice today, and they said that he probably would not practice tomorrow. So it sounds like he's very questionable for this week. Again, they're playing the Panthers, so take that for what it's worth. My light just shut off. Take that for what it's worth. Who knows what the Panthers are going to produce every week. And then again, the Titans next week. And then obviously you have Houston with CJ Stroud, who, he's missed now 2 weeks in a row. They were able to salvage a win the first week, but then got pretty much walloped by Cleveland this week and Joe Flacco and the hot streak that he's on. So lots of quarterback issues or I guess questions in this division. And I think the health of Trevor Lawrence and CJ Stroud are going to play an enormous role in who ends up winning this division. So keep an eye out for that. So one thing that we actually haven't talked about on this show is the MVP race. This time of year, it's the big hot topic of conversation. Who should win MVP? Who should win MVP? And every week it's somebody different. You talk about Brock Purdy, Lamar Jackson, Dak Prescott, Tyreek Hill, Christian McCaffrey. And then there's the whole separate debate on, is this only a quarterback award, or should it be only a quarterback award? I think it's become that personally, and I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. I know that the quarterback is arguably the most important position in all of sports. Without a good quarterback, you're going nowhere. Take a look at the Jets this year with what happened with their quarterback. On paper, they had a phenomenal quarterback, and then everything fell apart, and their season pretty much fell apart. So I don't argue that the value of a quarterback, but I think it's on a case-by-case basis. For me, and this is a shout out to my dad, he has kind of instilled this in me for as long as I can remember with MVP, whether it's football, baseball, basketball. And I've come to believe this, that the MVP, when you look at an MVP, it's what does their team look like without them? How will their team perform if something happens to them, right? So for me personally, that eliminates Christian McCaffrey and Brock Purdy right away, because I think that that system is plug and play. Personally, I know McCaffrey, he's a beast. He can catch the ball out of the backfield. I get all that. But I think if you put another very talented running back in that system, they're going to thrive, personally. And Brock Purdy, I love Brock Purdy. I think he's a great kid, great dude, great story. But I think if you throw their backup, Sam Darnold, in there, I think he's going to do fine. Obviously, we've seen Jimmy Garoppolo go to the Super Bowl and go to the NFC Championship in this system under Kyle Shanahan. So I think that eliminates, in my opinion, it eliminates Brock Purdy as well. And so I wrote down 2 names. One is a quarterback and one is not. So I wrote down Tyreek Hill and Lamar Jackson. And I think I'm leaning Tyreek Hill, even though he won't win it. This is, he's kind of fallen out of the discussion. But for me, he is the most valuable player in this league and the most valuable player to his team. A perfect example is 2 weeks ago, I think it was, Monday Night Football against the Titans. He went out in the middle of the first quarter with an ankle sprain, I think it was, and he missed a good majority of the game. I think he came in towards the end of the fourth quarter, but the Dolphins looked completely out of sync. They did not look like the Dolphins. They had no flow. Obviously, it was one of their season lows in points for the season. I think they scored 20 or 23 points. And, it was a prime example of how valuable Tyreek Hill is in that offense, because as soon as he came back in, Tua was stretching the field. Tua had rhythm. You could just tell he was more comfortable. And I think that was pretty much the perfect example of what happens when your best player is not there, what your team looks like. And so for me personally, I don't think there's anybody more valuable to their team than Tyreek Hill. That's my opinion. So if it were me, if I had a vote, I'd probably lean towards giving him the award. I could also make an argument for Lamar Jackson because, Baltimore, since Lamar has been in the league, Baltimore has always done a phenomenal job at catering the offense around him, making the system built for him. And so, it's kind of the complete opposite of what I just talked about with Christian McCaffrey and Brock Purdy, how you can throw anybody in that system and it's kind of plug and play and they'll be successful. I think the opposite could be said about Baltimore, whereas if you throw in another quarterback in that system, it's not going to look the same, and they're probably not going to be nearly as successful as Lamar Jackson is in that system. So those are my two picks, with, again, the edge, me giving it to Tyreek Hill. But again, I know I'm the minority in this conversation. I know that it's going to go to a quarterback. It might even go to Christian McCaffrey. Who knows? But for me, again, what does your team look like when you take your best player away? Or what does the team look like when you take this player away? Same way I would argue that Aaron Judge should be the MVP every year in the American League. And granted, I'm a Yankee fan, I'm biased, but the Yankees showed what they look like without Aaron Judge this year when he got that toe injury and missed several weeks. They were a complete loss without their captain, without their best player, their best hitter, their best defensive player. They were a complete shell of themselves. Whereas Shohei Ohtani, again, this is a baseball conversation, so maybe not everybody's going to be into this conversation and understand what I mean. Shohei Ohtani is a generational talent. Obviously, he's the next Babe Ruth. Some people say he's better than Babe Ruth. He can hit, he can pitch, he puts up phenomenal numbers. But if you go to my argument, which is what does your team look like without you, the Angels are still a subpar, terrible team without Shohei Ohtani. He doesn't bring them to that next level of success where Aaron Judge does. And I think the same conversation can be said in the football field for Tyreek Hill and Lamar Jackson. Those guys elevate their teams, whereas if they weren't there, these teams would not be successful. So again, I think that's why I have those guys in there, and that's why I eliminated the two candidates from San Francisco, because I think San Francisco would still be without one of those two guys, would be in those two guys being Brock Purdy and Christian McCaffrey. I still think that San Francisco would be a 10 plus win team easily. So that's my take on the MVP race. I'll be curious to see what Jeff says when he comes back as to who his MVP would be. I know my thinking isn't necessarily in line with the majority of people when it comes to the quarterback position, so that's fine. But that's just the way that I've always been. That's where my dad taught me, and that's kind of the way that I've always been ingrained and thought about it. So yeah, I'd love your guys' feedback on that. Feel free to, message me or comment on the link when we end up posting this, and just, if you agree, if you think I'm crazy, who your MVP should be. I think that would be a great conversation for next week as well when Jeff comes back. So feel free to send in any comments or critiques, if you will, on that conversation, because I think it's a great conversation. There's really no, in my opinion, there's really no wrong answer as to who your MVP is or how you look at it. The one thing that I will say is I don't think that it should be limited to just quarterbacks, but it's hard when the quarterback is the most valuable position on the field. So we'll leave that for now, and I'm going to transition quickly to my power rankings, which is going to be pretty quick because nothing changed. Well, none of the teams changed. My order changed slightly at the top, and so basically all I did is I flip-flopped the Ravens and the 49ers. So now the Ravens are 1, 49ers are 2. Miami stayed at 3, Cleveland stayed at 4, Detroit stayed at 5. I really had no reason to switch those. So those are my top 5. Very, very similar to last week. Obviously, excuse me, with the Ravens beating the Niners, felt like it was appropriate to flip-flop them. What to watch for this week? Couple big games that there's not as many as I went over last week, but 2 big ones for seedings and just momentum kind of going into the playoffs. There's a Saturday primetime game, Lions at Cowboys. 8:30. I think it's ESPN. I think they're doing that instead of Monday Night Football. They don't have a Monday night game, so they're doing Saturday instead for some reason. So that'll be a really good matchup. Obviously, the Lions just locked up the NFC North for the first time in a very long time. I think it's since 1993. I heard today or something crazy like that. So I'm super pumped for the Lions. I love Dan Campbell. I like Jared Goff too. I think he's a great story when you talk about, he was kind of, when you look at that trade with the Rams and the Lions, obviously Stafford going to the Rams, and then the Lions get a boatload of picks, but then they also got Jared Goff, who pretty much was like a salary dump, like, hey, take this contract off our hands if you're the Rams, like we don't want him anymore. And so he kind of was just sent off to the island, kind of an outcast. Nobody really talked about him as part of that trade. And when you think about, I think they won 1 game his first season. It was his first season, and it was Dan Campbell's first season. They won 1 game, and that was only 2 or 3 years ago. And so for them to have 11 wins, be the NFC North champions, it's just a great story, and it's a credit to him. It's a credit to Dan Campbell. So I'm excited for them. They're playing the Cowboys, who obviously came off a loss at Miami, which I was very surprised about. I expected them to beat Miami. It was a good win for Miami, the first time they've really shown that they can beat, quality competition with the 10-win Cowboys. And the Cowboys, man, they have such a drastic, when you look at their statistics at home versus on the road, it's night and day. I mean, they put up almost 40 points a game at home versus I think it's like 22 or 23 at home on the road. Their record is they're undefeated at home, and I think they only have 3 wins on the road. They're like 3-6 on the road, so or 3-4, something like that. But it's a drastic difference, and so that's going to need to be figured out pretty quick. When you look at the fact that they are currently a wild card team, obviously they have 10 wins, but if things finish where they're at now, the Eagles are going to be the division winner, and the Cowboys are going to be that first wild card spot, that number 5 seed. And so every one of their playoff games will be on the road. So they're going to need to figure that out pretty quick if they want to go anywhere. Obviously, this week is at home, so that's not necessarily one of the storylines, but it should be a good matchup nonetheless. And then probably the game of the week is Miami at Baltimore, and it's actually a 1:00 game on Sunday. I was pretty surprised at that. Didn't get flexed to either a primetime game or at least a 4:00 game. I don't know why it's at 1:00. I don't love that, but nobody cares. The NFL doesn't care what I think. People are going to watch regardless, but it's going to be a phenomenal game. 12-3 versus 11-4. So Baltimore currently has the number 1 seed. Miami's right behind them at the 2. And obviously that could flip flop if Miami pulls off the huge, I think it would be a massive upset. Just given the fact that how amazing Baltimore looked at San Francisco, and then this game is at Baltimore. It's going to be more than likely cold weather. Miami's obviously a warm weather team on the road, so we'll see. I think that Baltimore wins this game and probably locks up that number 1 seed, but it should be a great matchup nonetheless. From a fantasy football perspective, obviously most of your leagues should be approaching the championship round. And so there were tons of great performances this last week, but I'm really going to only highlight one, and it's partly for selfish reasons, and that's Amari Cooper. He had an unbelievable game this week. His stat line, he had 11 catches, 265 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So if you're in a standard PPR league, points per reception, that equated to 51.5 points. And he single-handedly won me my semifinal matchup and put me into the finals this week. So I'm pumped about that. That's why I said it's for selfish reasons. One thing I thought was really, really interesting, and it just it speaks to the talent in the league and the guys that can very easily win you your matchup. If Jeff and I have talked about it all the time. Like if you have this guy on your team, you're in good shape every single week. And so I had 2 different semifinal matchups this week in 2 leagues, and I was facing the same 3 guys in both leagues. The quarterback was Lamar Jackson. The running backs were Christian McCaffrey and Kyren Williams, the running back from the Rams. Both teams in 2 completely separate leagues had those 3 players. And I thought that was really interesting because that shows you that those are guys, and you don't typically think of Kyren Williams in that category, but he's had a really good season, and obviously McCaffrey and Lamar Jackson, they go without saying. But I thought that was really interesting. Like I said, it goes to the point that me and Jeff have always talked about, where Travis Kelce, and obviously not so much the last few weeks, but he used to be that guy. If you had him on your team, you were in good shape every week. And this season, it seems to be Lamar Jackson and Christian McCaffrey, which is why both of those other teams I was facing were in the semifinals. So I just thought that was really interesting. But Amari Cooper had an amazing week. George Pickens had an awesome week, which I would venture to guess most people had him on their bench, just because the Steelers have shown no signs of offense. Pickens hasn't really put up any big games, but he had 150 yards and 2 touchdowns, had over 30 points. So if you started him, good for you, man. You probably did, you rewarded yourself in a big way by making that decision, but I would venture to guess that most people did not start him. But nevertheless, we are approaching championship week for fantasy football. So make sure we have a Saturday game. We have the Thursday game. Jets at Browns is the Thursday game this week. So Amari Cooper's playing. Obviously, Joe Flacco, if you're desperate for a quarterback, he might not be a bad start, but the Jets do have a phenomenal defense, pass defense specifically. So I'm actually myself not totally comfortable with the Amari Cooper matchup, even coming off of that phenomenal week, just because the Jets cornerbacks are both great. But we'll see what happens there. So make sure you pay attention to your lineups, and good luck going into the championship week in fantasy football. If you're like me, I've already won because I'm in a money league, and we do 500 for first place and 200 for second place. It's a 14-team league, so the pot was pretty big. So I've already won at least a little bit, but obviously it would be nice to win the full pot. So good luck to all of you. If any of you have been able to make a championship week, and then we are going to finish off by just doing our picks for next week. I'm at a loss. Jeff has officially, I think, mathematically. No, I mean I would have to go 2-0 the remaining 2 weeks, and he would have to go 0-2. But I went 0-2 again last week, and just two horrible picks. Obviously, the Chiefs at the Raiders, which I already talked about, they were my lock. I was convinced they were going to not only win that game, but they were going to take over the number 1 seed, which just did not happen. And then the Colts over the Falcons. That I literally sat there on Sunday and I was like, this makes no sense to me. How does this outcome happen? When you take a team like the Colts, who have been on fire, have been having all these big wins, and then you take a team like the Falcons, who we just talked about, had probably arguably the worst loss of anybody this season. The clunker that they had against Carolina, the 1-win Carolina Panthers, they had just come off that terrible loss, and then Atlanta decides to beat the Colts. I don't understand that at all. I was so sure. I said that the Colts could also have been my lock as well, because I didn't understand how the Falcons were favored by 1 point. But what do I know at this point? I don't know. The Falcons won handily last week, and so I went 0-2. And on the flip side, Jeff went 2-0. So he's pretty much got this thing on lock. He had the Bills over the Chargers, and then he had the Browns over the Texans, which, again, I don't know how the Texans were favored in that game. They were favored by 2.5. when you talk about the fact that CJ Stroud was out, the Browns have been on a hot streak. That line made no sense to me, but Jeff took advantage of it, so good on him. So he sits at 17-9. I am even at 13-13, so he has a 4-game lead on me. So basically, I would have to go 2-0 so 4-0 the last 2 weeks, and he would have to go 0-4 for us to even tie. So I'm not loving that, but we're going to continue this nonetheless. So his lock, again, I let him pick this week. He texted me his picks, obviously because he's not here. His lock is the Bills over the Pats, which I don't know anything anymore because of these picks. I've done so bad, but that one, I think I said this week to my brother-in-law about the Bills because he's a diehard Bills fan. I think that nobody plays to the level of their competition like the Bills do. Meaning, if they play a 12-win team and there's just a ton of hype around the game, they're going to come out guns blazing. They're gonna play phenomenal, kind of like they did against the Chiefs and the Cowboys and even the Eagles. Even though they didn't win that game, they played great. Whereas this past week against the 5-win Chargers, coming off of firing their head coach and losing by over 40 points, the Bills had to win on a field goal with under a minute left in the game. So they didn't blow their socks off by any means. So I feel like the Bills have this problem where, again, they played down or up to the level of their competition, which is great once you get into the playoffs because you're playing great competition every week, so that shouldn't be an issue. But games like this one against the Patriots, it scares me a lot for them, especially when you talk about the Patriots beating the Broncos on Sunday Night Football this past week, a decent win, a 7-win team. So they're coming off a win. Belichick knows he is probably coaching his last few games in New England. So I don't know, that matchup scares me. I still think the Bills are going to win. I think they're probably going to win out and make the playoffs, but I don't know that I would have been confident enough to put that as my lock. But Jeff clearly knows more than me, so we'll go with that. And then his upset is the Raiders over the Colts. The Colts are favored by 3 points. My lock is I have the 49ers over Washington. Again, what do I know? But that seems like a no-brainer to me. The Commanders have the worst defense in the league. I mean, they let the Jets score 30 points this week with Trevor freaking Siemian. So I think if the Jets can score 30 points, 49ers should be able to put up 50 on them. So we'll see what happens there. And then my upset is actually the Lions over the Cowboys. Cowboys are favored by 6 points. I know the stats that I already talked about in the narrative that the Cowboys are unbeatable at home and shaky on the road, but I think that's got to end at some point, and I think that the Lions are playing great football right now. They're going to come in there and they're going to pull the upset. So those are our picks for the week, and so we will keep you updated on that next week. So that's what I got for you this week. It's a little shorter than I would have liked, but flying solo, I wanted to at least get something in front of you guys. So again, let me know what you thought about my MVP conversation. I think that that's a really interesting topic and talking point. So send in anything that you guys either think about that or want to talk about for next week. Let us know if you're in any fantasy football championships, how you did, what decisions you had to make, anything like that, so we can chime in and talk about that next week. Like I said, Jeff is back. He will be back in person with me next week. We will be recording on Monday, New Year's Day, instead of Sunday. So we may not get it out Tuesday like we normally do. But we have a plan in place. We're going to record and do our Week 17 show on Monday, New Year's Day, during the college football playoff games. So stay tuned for that. Hope you guys enjoyed. Have a great week.
Thanks for listening to What Did They Know podcast. Make sure to follow us on all of our social media outlets to see future episode details. And don't forget to send in any questions or topics that you want to see the guys discuss in their weekly episodes to come.